Hello, listeners, from Roy Demare Vincent, who is literally, as I record this, just back from the Highlands of Scotland. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to devote to this weekend's broadcast to that trip. So it'll be more of a travelogue and not worry too much about the antics of May or Trump and the European Union as they try to negotiate a hard position regarding Brexit. So what I was doing was visiting basically Inverness, where there is the headquarters of a university called the University of the Highlands and Islands, which is spread right across northern Scotland, but whose headquarters and what they call the Inverness College are right there in Inverness City, although they've actually built a very new campus just outside the city, and the bit that I have been negotiating with is the forestry department, because I do have a link as a visiting professor to the university in Ekaterinburg called the Ural State Forest Engineering University. It is very big compared with anything in Britain, because we're talking about thousands of students, 6,000 full time, and most of them have something to do with forestry or wood processing. Whereas when you're looking at the UHI, as I can call it, or indeed Cumbria University, where I'm also associated, the numbers of students run into a few dozen, and the teachers are maybe enough to count on two hands. Let's say two hands, not one. Anyway, we with an associate from Ekaterinburg visited for 2 days the university and the forestry department, and in fact, on the second day we also went to the Forestry Commission. That's the Scottish Forestry Commission, which is very practical in the sense that they plan the planting and the redevelopment of forests and woods, working in association with the university. In fact, the lady who took us to the Forestry Commission is a member of their board of directors, though the person who actually introduced us to Inverness and to the forestry department is a certain Joachim Böhm, who is German but with Canadian nationality, and he's a genuine wood technician. He knows how to plan and plant, or have them planted, I guess, the various trees. But today I want to tell you about the driving and the visiting we did, which started in Edinburgh, but we didn't spend very long in Edinburgh this time, but drove up to the southern end of Loch Ness, to the town of Fort Augustus. Now, Loch Ness is long and thin, and I learned a lot about Loch Ness by going on a boat ride on it. But the other thing that was interesting in Fort Augusta was to watch the locks, because it is perfectly possible now, and has been, I think, since the 19th century, for boats to go in at one end in Inverness from the North Sea and navigate the lake and various canals and locks and come out in the on the west side of Scotland. I guess that's the Irish Sea, but it might have some other name there. There are locks to get the boats up out of the North Sea and into the River Ness, which runs into Loch Ness, and then they can go down Loch Ness, and at Fort Augusta they go back up further. They go up through a series of 3 locks next to each other. So from Loch Ness they go up through 3 locks, and each lock, of course, when you squash all the boats into it and they open the sluice gates and it gradually fills up, and then they open the gates again and move on. Each operation like that takes a good half hour, so you have to be pretty patient. Well, I guess I looked at the blokes on the boats and they did indeed look very patient. A whole different lifestyle. Now, Loch Ness is very deep, about 600 feet. It's not very wide, a mile, sometimes a mile and a half, but rather long. It's the top end of what they call the Great Glen, which is a massive division between 2 land masses. And according to the guide on the boat, the western side of that landmass actually should have belonged to North America. North America broke away from the continent many millions of years ago, but left this bit behind. So it's got the same type of soil and rock and even animals as North America, whereas the eastern side is firmly attached to Europe. And the two sides do in fact look quite different. So lots of really fresh water in Loch Ness. I like to say it's got more water in than all the lakes in England combined. They didn't say all the lakes in Scotland combined, but all the lakes in England combined. And it's very deep. I think they mentioned a figure of about 600 feet. But it's not quite the deepest in Scotland. The deepest is the lake, or loch rather, Moray. Loch Ness does have fish in it, including especially salmon and trout, plus some weird Arctic fish, which shouldn't be there at all, but must have been trapped in the waters of Loch Ness many thousands of years ago, after the ice, as a result of the Ice Age. Loch Ness is far removed from having clean, clear waters such as we might be used to in Lake Annecy. On the contrary, it's brown and murky, and after just a few feet from the surface, you can't actually see anything. It's so full of, well, not exactly dirt, it's bits of floating peat, basically. And the same peat has brought a lot of acidity to the water, so that although it has these fish I just mentioned, the fish aren't particularly nice to eat. And even when you read, as I did, in Urquhart Castle about what they ate many hundreds of years ago, it said the locals don't really like to eat the fish from Loch Ness because it tastes so bizarre, and they prefer to get the fish coming in from the North Sea via Inverness. About halfway up the Loch Ness on the western side, where there is a coastal road, I couldn't see much in the way of a road on the other side because there were sheer cliffs coming down into the water, is the ruin of a castle. It's called the Urquhart Castle. It looks like Urquhart, QU in the middle, castle, which is a complete ruin, but they've tried to piece bits together and make a story about it. And there are nice guides there which give you some story of how it was built way back, I think, in the 13th century, if not the 12th. Really quite badly damaged by the MacDonalds in 1575, I think it was. And then it was finally scuppered completely at the end of the 17th century. It was a case of it was not very interesting to maintain it. The English at the time were occupying it. Sometimes the Scots occupied it. They were fighting over it. But in the end, it wasn't sufficiently strategic to be worth keeping. So the owners at the end of the 17th century blew up the gate, which meant it was quite useless thereafter. And then many people took away the stones for other bits of building. So it is really it's a real ruin. But when you go there, you get these quite amazing views on Loch Ness, and you can kind of cast your mind back to the medieval period in its heyday. It used to get regularly attacked by the MacDonalds from the Isle of Skye. They were folk who thought nothing of raiding and wrecking things, and there's one fabulous list of things they nicked from the castle. They completely emptied it, took all the cows, all the chickens, everything they could find, all the cutlery, and took it back to Skye, and that was the big attack of 1575. Just a couple of miles on from the Castle Urquhart is a visitor centre for those who are intrigued by the legends associated with the Loch Ness Monster. And it's quite a good show. You sort of go through caves, and they have little films and commentaries. You come out still being very doubtful. It is very doubtful that there's ever been a real monster. There's not enough food. The temperature's not right. So anything in the way of a monster sort of left over from the ancient history period is most unlikely. There could be some very giant fish, and they have indeed come across in the past huge fish which could be taken as a monster, but of course they don't come and sort of show humps and their head out of the water. All those sightings and photographs turn out to be hoaxes, or they are described by people who managed not to have their camera with them at the time. I certainly can't believe it, and I don't think many people can, but the canny Scots like to keep the legend and the doubt going just in case, and of course it brings in the tourists. And the place gets quite crowded. When I was there this week, it was easy to drive around, easy to find hotels and things, but as the summer progresses, foreigners and Sassenachs come in such vast numbers that there are traffic jams everywhere. Talking of traffic jams, by the way, the road between Inverness and Edinburgh is far from a good one. It has only a little bit of dual carriageway, and you sometimes see a sign up where they're expanding a single carriageway road to a dual carriageway road, and they introduced me at least to a new word because they say investing in Scotland, dualling. It's not dualling with an E, but dualling with an A, to say they're trying to make a dual carriageway to speed the traffic up a bit. But it was very slow going down to Edinburgh. Particularly, we came to some work they were doing on the dual carriageway, actually, and they didn't touch the other side. But the side we were on had one lane closed, and the lane that you could go down, you could only go when you waited for a convoy to go down. Then somebody drove ahead of the convoy at 10 miles per hour. So that was all a bit boring and a bit over the top, I thought. But it's their way of mending things and saying to hell with the traffic. I'll mention a bit about the forest cover in Scotland. It is the largest proportion in the UK, and it's growing. It's growing everywhere in the UK, by the way. It is desirable now to encourage the growth of forests, but there have been major changes in the approach to how they manage forests, because now they take into account everywhere the ecology and the beauty and the attraction of the place as distinct from looking at trees merely as something to be harvested for wood. And of course they've got spruce or fir trees and pine and sycamore, but none of those trees are very natural to Scotland or even to the UK. But the Scotch pine, of course, is natural to Scotland, and they have enough trees doing quite well, but there are two major problems keeping the trees, making it difficult for the Forestry Commission to keep them going. One problem is the deer, and the other problem is the wind. You can't do much about the wind. As for the deer, the issue at stake is land ownership, because deer bred for shooting on private land don't stay on the private land and wander all over the place and eat every bit of young tree they see. So that is an issue, and there's a move, I think, to try and combine forest management with land management, responsible land management. Which reminds me, there's an odd law in Scotland, which certainly doesn't apply in England, which is that you have the right of responsible entry everywhere. You can go on private land, provided you behave responsibly. It's only if the field is growing something to be harvested or it's a private garden that you don't go on that. But you're allowed to just wander around where you want, provided you are responsible. I must say that everybody we found in Scotland, be it in restaurants or hotels or the people at the university or the Forestry Commission, were extremely friendly and open, and we just think it's a great place, and I'm becoming quite Scotophile in my old age. So that's tells you about my last week or so. I better get back to some practical investment advice next week, and I'll try and do that. And we'll speak to you again then. Bye, Roy.